What do you do when your wife stages a divorce vote in your own living room, her friends smirking like jurors, and you realize the real betrayal isn't just hers? It's every husband she's been sampling behind their backs? My name is Hale, and I learned that a marriage can be sentenced to death without the defendant ever being told the charges, as long as the jury is already sitting on your couch with wine glasses and smug little smiles. I came home to my own living room and found it rearranged like a cheap courtroom, my wife planted in the center with her friends around her, legs crossed, shoulders angled, faces set in that practiced expression women wear when they want to look reasonable while doing something cruel. The television was off, the lamps were bright, and the air smelled like perfume layered over the faint bitterness of white wine that had been sitting too long, which meant they'd been waiting for me long enough to rehearse. My wife didn't stand when I walked in, and she didn't pretend surprise, because surprise would have required guilt, and guilt wasn't invited to this meeting. She sat at home with her friends and looked at me like a manager about to fire someone who has already cleared their desk. Then she said it, slow and clean, as if she had already said it out loud 3 times to make it feel true. "We've decided it's time to divorce you." Her friends smirked like the words were a punchline, and my life was the joke. The worst part wasn't that she said it. It was that she said we, as if a marriage was a committee and my vote was optional. I didn't answer right away, because I knew what she wanted from me, and I wasn't going to hand it over like a gift. She wanted an outburst, something messy that her friends could later describe with widened eyes, something that would make her the calm victim in her own story. I set my keys down on the entry table with deliberate care, and I kept my voice level, because a level voice is the one thing that makes performative people nervous. I looked at her friends one by one, not with anger, but with curiosity, because curiosity makes people feel exposed. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, if you counted the one half hidden behind a throw pillow, like she wasn't sure she had earned her cruelty yet. They had come dressed for moral authority, soft sweaters and careful makeup, and those necklaces that say, "I'm harmless," even when the eyes say I'm hungry. The one closest to my wife had her nails done in a pale color that cost too much and lasted too long, and she held her glass with both hands like she needed something to grip. The one beside her had the kind of smile that starts in the teeth and never reaches the eyes, and she kept glancing toward my wife as if waiting for cues. The third sat farther back, leaning forward, elbows on knees, a posture that looked like concern until you noticed the satisfaction underneath it. My wife watched me as if she expected me to plead, and when I didn't, she tried another tactic. She said she needed peace. She said I was hard to live with. She said we had grown apart. She said words like toxic and boundaries and emotional labor, the modern vocabulary of people who want to bury you under concepts so nobody asks for dates and specifics. Her friends nodded at the right moments, as if they were trained, as if they had practiced those nods in the mirror. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a performance built to be retold, and I could already see the future version of this story spreading through brunch tables like gossip with frosting. I let her finish, and then I asked quietly, who decided? The question was simple, but it landed hard, because simple questions force people to pick a liar. My wife tilted her head with a little sigh, the kind that signals patience, and she said they all had, because they cared about her, because they had seen how unhappy she was, because they wanted what was best. Her friends nodded again, and I watched their faces as if I were reading weather. I could see the tension in their shoulders, the small signals that told me they were less united than they wanted to look. I took a slow breath, and I asked another question, softer than the first. So none of you care she's been seeing your husbands? I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't point, because pointing makes it look like accusation. I said it like a fact already accepted, like a line item on an agenda. The room changed in a single second, the way it does when a pleasant lie is punctured, and everyone hears the hiss of air escaping. Wine glasses paused halfway to lips, Smirks froze and tried to become confusion. My wife's eyes widened just enough to show the first crack, and then she tried to cover it with anger, because anger is the fastest patch for fear. The woman with the pale nails blinked, fast and shallow, like her body had reacted before her mind could decide what to do. The woman with the dead smile actually laughed once, but it came out thin and wrong, the kind of laugh people make when they want to dismiss a truth without touching it. The one leaning forward pulled back slightly, as if the couch had suddenly become unsafe. My wife stared at me, her mouth tightening, her gaze sharp, like she wanted to cut the words out of the air. She called it disgusting. She called it a lie. She said I was trying to manipulate them because I couldn't handle being left. She said I was paranoid and controlling and cruel, and her friends latched onto those labels like life rafts, because labels are easier than evidence. The dead smile friend repeated my wife's words back to me in a different order, as if the repetition would make them stronger. The pale nails friend stared into her wine glass, like she might find a better reality at the bottom of it. I didn't argue with the adjectives. I didn't deny being hurt, because hurt is human and it makes you sloppy. I just asked again, who decided, because my wife's use of we had always been a tell, and I wanted them to hear it. My wife's nostrils flared, and she said she didn't need my approval to end the marriage. That part was true. Then she said the only reason I was saying this was to make her look bad in front of her friends, which was almost funny, because she had literally assembled her friends as a backdrop to announce my divorce like a group project. I sat down in the armchair across from them, not because I was tired, but because sitting makes you look unthreatening, and unthreatening men are harder to frame. I rested my hands on my knees and kept my posture open. My wife watched me like she was waiting for me to show my teeth. She wanted me to look like a villain, so she could feel like a hero. That was the whole point of bringing them here. Instead, I looked at the pale nails friend and asked how her husband was doing with his new late meetings. The question landed in her lap like a dropped knife. She stiffened and tried to smile, and she said his job was demanding, and she said she was proud of him. She said it too quickly, like she had been practicing that line for herself in the shower. I nodded slowly, then I looked at the dead smile friend and asked whether her husband's gym routine had been good for his health. Her smile twitched and threatened to break, and she said yes, he was finally taking care of himself. She said it with a brightness that was too sharp to be real. My wife interrupted, voice louder now, and told me to stop. She said I was embarrassing her. The irony was thick enough to chew. I asked her why she was so worried about embarrassment, since she had just tried to divorce me with an audience and a script. Her friends shifted, and in that shifting, I saw something important. They were not here because they were loyal to my wife. They were here because they thought they were safe. They thought the only target in this room was me. My wife tried to stand, then sat back down, then stood again, as if her body couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. She accused me of making things up. She said I had no proof. She said I was projecting. Then she said something that almost made me smile, because it was the first honest thing she'd said all evening. She said I was trying to destroy her friendships. That was the line that told me where her fear lived. She didn't fear losing me. She feared losing her stage. The pale nails friend finally spoke, voice small and brittle. She asked my wife if this was true. My wife's head snapped toward her, and for a moment her face did something ugly, something that wasn't curated. She told her friend not to listen to me. She told her friend I was desperate. She told her friend I was trying to poison them because I couldn't accept being replaced. Her voice had that subtle edge of command, the same edge she used when she corrected a waiter or redirected a conversation at a dinner party. She wasn't talking to a friend anymore. She was managing a risk. The dead smile friend leaned back and crossed her arms, and she said she didn't believe me, but her eyes didn't match her mouth. Her eyes were already doing math. The forward-leaning friend kept glancing toward the hallway, like she expected her husband to walk in and ruin the illusion. My wife noticed those glances, and I saw her control tightening, her jaw working, her hands moving as if she wanted to grab the room and shake it back into place. I kept my tone calm and asked one last question, because a man doesn't need a speech when he has a pressure point. If this is a group decision, I asked, why did you invite them instead of calling a lawyer first? My wife's friends looked at each other, because the question was simple, and the answer was uncomfortable. A lawyer would have made this real. Friends made it theatrical. My wife's eyes narrowed, and she tried to pivot again, but her voice had lost some of its smoothness. She said she wanted support. She said she wanted witnesses. She said she wanted to feel safe. She used the word safe like a shield, and I let it hang there for a second because I understood what she was doing. She wasn't just divorcing me. She was laying the foundation for a story where she was the endangered one, and where any boundary I set could be reframed as threat. That was when I realized the divorce announcement was not the main event. The main event was the narrative. The narrative was the weapon. The husbands were the secret fuel, and the wives were the audience she thought she controlled. I looked at the women on my couch and saw the beginning of a collapse in their faces, the moment when loyalty becomes suspicion and suspicion becomes rage. I stood up slowly and picked up my keys again, and I told them they could keep their meeting going without me because I had errands to run. I watched my wife's expression flicker because she wanted me to stay and fight, and she wanted me to lose control, and she wanted her friends to see it. Instead, I walked to the doorway and paused just long enough to add one more sentence, delivered like a neutral reminder rather than a threat. I told them that if they wanted to vote on my marriage, they should at least check their own houses first. Then I left, and I didn't look back, because I knew the second I closed that door, my wife would turn on her friends would turn on her, and every smirk in that room would start to rot into panic. I drove for almost 20 minutes before I realized I had no destination, because leaving that room had been instinct, not strategy, and instinct only buys you distance, not clarity. The streets looked ordinary, the kind of ordinary that makes your private disaster feel embarrassing, like you are the only person in a city full of functioning marriages who somehow managed to invite a tribunal into his own living room. I kept my hands steady on the wheel and let the anger burn low, because I had learned the hard way that hot anger turns into mistakes, and mistakes are exactly what a woman like my wife uses as proof that she was right all along. At a stoplight, my phone lit up with her name, and then the screen went dark again because I did not answer. I could already imagine the voice she would use, that careful blend of wounded and firm, the voice that makes outsiders nod while you stand there wondering how you became the villain in your own biography. I put the phone face down in the cup holder like it was contaminated, because at that moment anything she said would be bait, and I was done biting. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat there longer than made sense, watching people push carts like their biggest problem was whether they needed milk. The calm routine around me did something useful. It cooled the panic and left behind something sharper, a thin edge of purpose. My wife had not chosen a private conversation, not a lawyer's office, not even a neutral coffee shop. She chose the couch, the wine, the smug smiles, and the word we. That meant she believed she controlled the room, and she believed she controlled the story that would leave that room. The moment I mentioned the husbands, the room changed, and that change told me something important. I had hit a real nerve, and I had done it without raising my voice. I knew I could not win by shouting, because shouting only creates a clip other people can replay. If I wanted to survive what she was building, I needed receipts, timestamps, and a calm spine. I needed the kind of truth that could be held up by someone else, because the entire point of her ambush was to make me look like a man whose claims could be dismissed as bitterness. Bitter men are easy to discredit. Documented men are harder. So I opened my notes app and started writing a timeline, not dramatic, just basic, because basic is what stands up later. I wrote the date, the approximate time I walked in, the names of the friends as best as I could remember, and the exact wording that mattered. We have decided. I wrote my own response the way I said it, because memory gets slippery when stress rises, and I did not want to rely on a feeling later. Then I wrote the line that shifted the room, because I could still see the microsecond when the smirk died. When I finally went inside the store, I did not buy much, because I was not there to shop. I was there to move my body through a normal task, because normal tasks keep your mind from spiraling into imaginary scenes of revenge that never work in real life. I walked the aisles and let my brain run quietly in the background, like a machine warming up. If my wife had been seeing their husbands, then there had to be patterns, because affairs are rarely creative, and people who think they are clever repeat themselves in small ways. They repeat routines. They repeat alibis. They repeat phrases that sound practiced. They repeat the same time windows because it fits their schedules. They repeat locations because it feels safe. Back in the car, my phone lit again, not with her name this time, but with a bank notification from my own account, and that got my attention in a way her calls did not. The message was simple and boring, which is why it mattered. A small purchase had just been made at a local cafe, paid through a card tied to my primary account. The amount was not large, but the merchant was not one my wife used often, and the time was strange, late afternoon, when she was supposedly with friends. It could have been nothing, the kind of nothing you ignore for years, but after the living room tribunal, nothing was no longer an option. I opened the bank app, confirmed the charge, and took a screenshot that showed the date, time, and merchant name. Then I opened my calendar, because our calendar was shared for household logistics, and I checked what she had put there. She had entered something vague, a friend visit, no location, no details, because vagueness is convenient when you want freedom. I took a screenshot of that too, not because it proved an affair by itself, but because it set a baseline. Her official story was already designed to be uncheckable. I drove home slower than I had left because returning was not surrender, it was reconnaissance. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw her car there, and I felt a brief surge of rage because of course she had come home, of course she was still in the house, of course she felt entitled to occupy the space while declaring I was being removed from it. But I did not go inside right away. I sat for a moment and watched the front window, the curtain shifting slightly, the way a person watches when they think they are unseen. That curtain movement told me she was still performing, still monitoring the narrative. I entered through the side door and kept my steps quiet, because quiet steps don't announce emotions. The house was louder than it should have been for an empty room, because I could still hear their laughter in my head, and laughter leaves stains. The living room was mostly reset, wine glasses moved to the sink, couch cushions fluffed, the scene cleaned like it had never happened. That kind of reset is not the behavior of someone who feels guilty. It is the behavior of someone who feels justified. My wife was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass with exaggerated calm, and she did not look up right away because she wanted me to speak first. She wanted me to beg or rage or ask for explanations so she could hand me rehearsed answers. I did not give her that. I walked past her, opened a cabinet, and took out a folder we used for household paperwork, because nothing unsettles a manipulator like paperwork that is not theirs. She finally spoke, and her voice carried that same controlled patience from earlier, like she was the adult and I was the child who needed boundaries. She said we needed to have a mature conversation. She said the marriage was over. She said her friends were worried about her. She said I should accept reality. I nodded as if listening, because nodding encourages people to keep talking, and people reveal themselves when they believe they are winning. I moved into the small office space near the hallway, the one we used for bills and mail, and I closed the door halfway, not as a dramatic slam, just a boundary. On the desk was the family tablet, the shared device she loved because it made her feel like the curator of our life. The tablet was unlocked because she was careless when she felt powerful, and that carelessness was the first gift she had given me in months. I did not dig through messages. I did not open private apps. I did not do anything that would feel like spying because I had no interest in becoming the villain she wanted to claim I was. I stayed inside what was already shared in our household: the cloud photos, the shared calendar, the bank notifications tied to my account, and the general device notification previews that pop up without effort. Those things are not hacks. They are the residue of normal life. If my wife had been living a second life, normal life would eventually betray her. The photo app opened to a recent folder, and I saw images from the last few weeks, the kind of curated happiness she posted without asking me, because smiling for strangers was easier than honesty at home. I scrolled without tapping into anything sensitive, focusing on metadata, timestamps, and location tags that were already visible. Most were harmless, until I reached a cluster of pictures that made my stomach tighten. There were photos from a neighborhood charity event, nothing dramatic in the frame, just tables, signage, people in semi-formal clothes, and the kind of forced smiles you get when someone is collecting donations. But in the background of one photo, caught in a reflective surface near the venue entrance, was my wife's face angled toward a man's shoulder in a way that was not friendly. It was subtle, the kind of subtle that becomes invisible if you want it to, but I had spent enough years with her to know the difference between politeness and possession. I zoomed in, not obsessively, just enough to confirm what I was seeing, and my mouth went dry when I recognized the man. It was not a stranger. It was not some random person I could dismiss as a misunderstanding. It was Glenn, the husband of the dead smile friend from my couch, and he was wearing a jacket I had seen before, the jacket he wore to our neighborhood barbecues while his wife complimented my wife's taste in candles. I took a screenshot that included the visible timestamp, then backed out and checked the location data that the app displayed at the top. It listed a venue name and a date, clean and unromantic. I opened the next photo in the cluster, and there, near the edge of the frame, was a second man, leaning in close, his hand hovering near my wife's lower back in that half-touch that is more intimate than a full embrace. This one was Owen, the Pale Nails friend's husband, and the sight of him in my wife's orbit made something cold settle in my chest. I did not feel shocked anymore. Shock had passed back in the living room when I saw how quickly their faces changed. What I felt now was confirmation, and confirmation is a dangerous kind of calm. I saved 2 more screenshots, each one showing date and context, each one clean enough to be shown later without explanation. Then I noticed something that made my pulse kick harder. One of the photos was not taken at the charity event at all. It was taken in a condo mailroom, and the timestamp was in the middle of a weekday, during hours my wife claimed she was home, working on herself. I stared at the mailroom photo and realized, with a tight twist of irony, that she had not just been cheating, she had been recruiting. She had been using her friendships like camouflage while she stole their husbands. Then I heard my wife's footsteps outside the office door, slow, cautious, and I understood she had noticed the quiet. People like her can tolerate yelling because yelling feeds their story. What they cannot tolerate is silence paired with evidence. The door moved a fraction, and her voice sharpened, asking what I was doing. I did not answer. I simply turned the tablet slightly, so the screen glow reflected on the inside of the door, just enough for her to realize I was looking at something real. She stopped moving, and the house went very still. Because she finally understood I wasn't guessing anymore, and whatever she had planned next was about to change. My wife did not burst into the office like a guilty person caught in the act, because guilty people still believe in shame, and she had upgraded to something colder. She paused in the doorway with her hand on the frame, as if she were the homeowner interrupting a guest, and she asked what I thought I was doing with the tablet in a voice designed to sound reasonable. I rotated the screen a little more, not to taunt her, but to show her I wasn't imagining shadows, and I watched the smallest muscles around her eyes tighten, because her brain was already scrambling to rewrite what the evidence meant. She stepped inside and tried to take the tablet from me, but she did it carefully, with an open hand, because she knew sudden movements could be framed against her later. That awareness told me she was already thinking in terms of records and witnesses, which meant the living room meeting had not been a spontaneous cruelty. It had been a tactic. I held the tablet steady and asked her calmly why Glenn was in our photo stream leaning into her shoulder at a charity event his wife attended. I asked her why Owen was in a different shot with his hand close enough to count as a claim. I asked her why there was a condo mailroom photo midweek when she told me she was home. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't insult her, because insults give the other person something to cry about. She didn't answer the questions in order, because liars never do when they are cornered. She said I was invading her privacy, even though the device was shared. She said I was obsessed, even though the images were time-stamped. She said I was paranoid, even though she had staged a divorce vote like a committee decision. Then she tried to throw the whole thing into the emotional trash by claiming none of it mattered because our marriage was already over. That line was supposed to make me feel desperate, like a man trying to stop a train by standing on the tracks. I smiled, because it was the first time she had said something that could be useful. If the marriage was already over in her mind, then her behavior was no longer a mistake. It was a choice. Choices are easier to prove than accidents. I asked her whether she understood what she had done in that living room, not to me, but to her friends, because she had invited witnesses into our home and then tried to shame me into silence. Her face hardened, and she said she had needed support. She said her friends had seen how unhappy she was. She said they were worried about her safety, and she said the word safety again, like she was pressing a button to summon sympathy from an invisible crowd. I leaned back in the chair and let her talk, because when people weaponize therapy language, they often reveal the script underneath. She told me I was controlling. She told me I monitored her. She told me I made her feel small. She told me I never listened. The accusations came out in a rhythm, too smooth, too structured, as if she had practiced them in the mirror while her friends nodded along. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't defend myself, because defending yourself inside a script just makes you a character in the other person's play. When she finally paused, I asked one question that had nothing to do with feelings. I asked her whether she had slept with Glenn. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, and the delay was enough. She tried to recover by calling it an insane question, but her eyes moved to the side for a fraction of a second, the way people check their exits when they realize the door is locked. She said Glenn had been helping her through a hard time. She said they had talked. She said everyone was friends, and it was normal to be close at events. Then she said something that almost made me laugh, because it was the kind of excuse a teenager gives when caught sneaking out. The photo angle was misleading. I tapped the timestamp and showed her the sequence, because sequences kill excuses. The first image showed the charity event, the second showed the mailroom, and the third showed the coffee roaster tour she never mentioned. It wasn't one awkward frame, it was a pattern. Her jaw clenched, and she asked how long I had been collecting things. The word was telling because she was trying to recast my calm documentation as stalking. I told her I hadn't collected anything until she brought a jury into my living room and tried to declare my life over by group vote. I told her that if she wanted to play in public, she should expect the truth to show up with receipts. She turned away from the desk and paced once, a small loop like an animal testing the size of its cage. Then she tried a different angle, softer, almost affectionate, as if she were about to offer a compromise. She said we could end this quietly. She said she didn't want things to get ugly. She said she would be fair, and she offered the kind of fairness that always comes with a price tag. She wanted me to move out. She wanted me to leave the house quickly. She wanted me to stop talking to her friends. She wanted me to let her control the story, because the story was her oxygen. I asked her whether her friends knew. I asked her whether the women on my couch had any idea what she had been doing with their husbands, or whether they were simply too loyal to question the woman who spoke in confident sentences. My wife's face flashed with irritation, and she told me not to drag other people into our marriage. The hypocrisy was so thick, it almost felt like a scent. She had dragged them in first. She had arranged them as witnesses to my humiliation. Now she wanted them protected, because they were no longer props. They were potential casualties, and she did not like casualties she couldn't control. I stood up and walked past her into the hallway, not rushing, just moving, because movement forces decisions. I went to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out the small folder where we kept house documents, the kind of boring papers she never looked at because boredom doesn't feel like power. I took out the information for our joint accounts, the mortgage paperwork, and the emergency contacts list, and I set it on the table like a boundary line. My wife followed me, her expression tight, and she asked what I was doing now, because she could feel control slipping. I told her I was not moving out, not tonight, and not because she said a committee had voted. I told her that if she wanted a divorce, she could file properly through lawful channels, and I would respond properly through lawful channels. I told her that starting now, everything would be written, and everything would be documented, because the moment she used the word "we" in front of witnesses, she turned our marriage into a public claim. I watched her eyes narrow at the word documented, because documented was the opposite of the fog she preferred. She tried to provoke me, as if anger would still rescue her. She said I was pathetic. She said nobody respected me. She said her friends had always thought she could do better. She said the marriage had been a mistake. She said she had stayed out of pity. She threw every insult she could find at my calm face, because calm faces make cruel people feel powerless. I nodded once, as if acknowledging whether, and I asked her whether she wanted to keep lying or whether she wanted to negotiate terms like an adult. That question hit her harder than any insult could, because it exposed the real divide. I was not begging for love. I was managing a breach. Then she did something that confirmed everything. She reached for her phone and started typing, fast, with the phone angled away from me, because she was sending reinforcements. I didn't try to grab it. I didn't demand to see it. I simply took my own phone out and opened the camera, and I photographed her posture, the way she hid the screen, the way her thumb moved in quick bursts, because those details matter when a story is later told to people who weren't there. She froze when she realized what I was doing, and she demanded I stop. I told her I was recording the moment she decided to escalate again. She scoffed and said she was just telling her friends she was okay. The word "okay" sounded childish coming from her. I asked her why she needed to tell them anything at all if this was a private divorce decision. She didn't answer. She just kept typing, and then my phone buzzed with a group notification because we shared one neighborhood group chat for logistics. Someone had posted something vague about a difficult situation and supporting a friend, and the timestamp lined up exactly with my wife's typing. There it was, the next layer of pressure beginning to form, the rumor wave starting as a drip before it became a flood. My wife looked at me with a bright, almost excited anger, as if she had just pulled a lever and expected a trap door to open beneath my feet. She said I should be careful, because people don't like men who can't accept being left. She said she could make things very uncomfortable for me if I didn't cooperate. She said it with that calm villain tone she had always used when she wanted to pretend she was only stating facts. I took a screenshot of the group message and saved it. Then I set my phone down and looked at her steadily. I told her simply that every time she tried to pressure me through other people, she created a new piece of evidence that showed motive. I told her she was building my case for me. Her expression flickered, just a fraction, because she understood what motive meant in civil rooms with neutral facilitators. For a moment, the kitchen was silent except for the refrigerator hum, and in that silence, I could almost hear her recalculating. Then she changed tactics again, and this time her voice softened into something that sounded almost pleading. She said she had made mistakes. She said she had been lonely. She said she had needed attention. She said it wasn't what I thought, and she said the husbands had pursued her, not the other way around. She offered me a version of herself that looked vulnerable, because vulnerability can be used like a shield if you weaponize it correctly. I didn't take the bait. I asked her whether she was willing to tell her friends the truth, in writing, right now, with the same confidence she used when she told me we were divorcing. Her eyes hardened again, because written truth is the one thing a liar cannot tolerate. She said no, because she didn't want to hurt anyone. That was another lie, because she had been hurting them for months, and she had done it while smiling into cameras. I told her she had one choice if she wanted this to stay quiet. She could end the rumor machine she started, and she could stop using her friends as a tribunal. If she did not, I would answer the only way that works against coordinated smirks, with timelines, dates, and proof shared at the right moment, with the right witnesses. I didn't say it as a threat. I said it as a plan. Plans scare people who survive on chaos. My wife stared at me like she was seeing a stranger because she had built her power on the belief that I would either explode or collapse. Instead, I was calmly drawing lines and labeling them. She glanced toward the living room, toward the hallway, toward the front door, as if she were checking whether any of her friends might arrive soon to restore her confidence. Then the doorbell rang, and the sound was soft but final, like the beginning of the next act. Because she wasn't alone in this, and the reinforcements had already been called. The doorbell rang again before I could even decide whether I wanted to open it, and the timing told me everything I needed to know about how long my wife had been texting while pretending she was only checking in with people. She didn't move toward the door like a host greeting guests, because she wasn't a host. She was a director cueing actors to their marks, and she wanted me to be standing in the wrong place when the audience arrived. I stayed where I was, leaning lightly against the kitchen counter, hands relaxed, shoulders loose, because the fastest way to lose power in a staged confrontation is to look like you're bracing for impact. She walked past me with that crisp, confident stride she saves for situations where she thinks she will be validated, and she opened the door with a bright, performative smile that vanished the moment she glanced back at me. Tessa stood on the porch first, pale nails curled around a phone she held too tightly, and beside her was Marla with the dead smile and the polished posture of someone who thinks she cannot be embarrassed. June was behind them, hovering in the doorway, light with a look that was already half apology and half curiosity, the expression of a person who doesn't want to be cruel, but enjoys being near cruelty when it's not aimed at her. They stepped inside without waiting for permission, which is what people do when they believe the house belongs to their narrative more than it belongs to the man paying the mortgage. My wife closed the door behind them and positioned herself between me and the entryway, not as a protective gesture, but as a framing device, because she wanted them to see her as the barrier and me as the threat. She spoke first, her tone soft and concerned, and she told them she was fine. She just needed support, and she didn't want anything to escalate. The words were gentle, but her eyes were sharp, because she was watching how they would react to me, and she was ready to adjust the script if they didn't follow it. Marla was the first to try to reassert control, because people like her cannot stand the feeling of being uncertain in someone else's living room. She said she was shocked by what I had accused my wife of earlier, and she said it was inappropriate, and she said I should apologize. She said it in the calm, bright voice of a woman delivering a correction, as if I were a child who had said something rude at dinner. Tessa stood slightly behind Marla and kept glancing toward the hallway, as if her husband might walk out of a closet like a bad surprise. June didn't speak at first. She just watched my wife's face carefully, and that told me June was not fully convinced, even if she wanted to be. I didn't answer Marla right away, because answering the wrong person is how you get trapped in a loop of defensive explanations. I looked at my wife and asked her calmly why she had invited them back after she had already staged the divorce announcement earlier. My wife's mouth tightened, and she said she was trying to keep the peace. I nodded once because the line was predictable, and I turned to the three women and asked whether they understood they were being used as props in a story designed to humiliate me. My wife interrupted immediately, voice louder, because she couldn't tolerate me reframing the scene. She told them I was unstable. She told them I had been going through her things. She told them I was making accusations because I couldn't accept the marriage was over. She used that phrase again, marriage is over, with the confidence of someone who believes repetition can replace process. Marla nodded along on cue, because Marla's loyalty wasn't to my wife as a person, it was to my wife as a social force, the one who organizes dinners and knows everyone's secrets and controls the group chat temperature. Tessa's nod was smaller, slower, and each nod looked like it cost her something. June finally spoke, carefully, and asked what I meant about the husbands. My wife's eyes flashed in warning, and she tried to shut it down by calling it a disgusting lie. But June wasn't asking like a smirking juror anymore. She was asking like a woman suddenly imagining a stranger's hands on her own husband's shoulders. I could see Marla trying to pull June back into the safe story, but the question had already been placed on the table, and questions don't disappear just because someone calls them inappropriate. I walked toward the office doorway without rushing, because rushing is how you look guilty, and I picked up the tablet again with slow, deliberate movements. My wife stepped forward as if to block me, then hesitated, because blocking is an admission of fear, and she didn't want to show fear in front of them. I held the tablet at chest height, angled it toward the room, and asked June whether she recognized Glenn's jacket from the neighborhood barbecue photos. June stared at the screen, her eyes narrowing, and her lips parted slightly in a soundless inhale. Marla leaned in too quickly, trying to control what was being seen, and my wife snapped that I was twisting things. Tessa's face went tight, and she asked what event the photo was from. I told her the charity night, and I said the date out loud because dates are the opposite of gaslighting. My wife tried to laugh it off, but the laugh came out clipped and brittle sounds always travel farther than they should. I scrolled to the next image and paused long enough for the screen to load fully, and there was Owen near my wife's side, with a hand hovering at her back in that half-touch that is both claim and warning. Tessa's throat moved as she swallowed, and the color drained from her face in a way no amount of makeup can hide. My wife lunged toward the tablet then, not with violence, but with urgency, and her hand slapped the edge of it hard enough to tilt it downward. The motion was small, but in a room full of women trained to read social cues, small motions become sirens. Marla's dead smile finally died, and for the first time she looked less like an attorney and more like a wife doing math. June stepped back as if the air had changed temperature, and Tessa's hand moved toward her own phone, because a threatened spouse always reaches for the device that can summon a truth they are scared to hear. My wife started talking fast, pouring words like water over a fire, saying the photos were misleading, saying it was innocent, saying people were friendly at events, saying I was controlling and jealous, saying I was trying to isolate her from her support system. She tried to drown the room in adjectives again, because adjectives are fog, and fog is where she thrives. I didn't argue with any of it. I just asked her, in a steady voice, whether she was willing to say, in front of her friends, that she had never crossed a line with their husbands. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people uncomfortable enough to fill it with the truth. She didn't answer cleanly. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. She dodged into a speech about boundaries and trust, and how I should not put her on trial. Marla tried to rescue her by scolding me for being cruel, but Marla's voice had lost its confidence, and confidence is everything in a room like this. Tessa kept staring at the tablet with a fixed intensity, as if she could will the image to change if she looked hard enough. June looked at my wife's face, then at mine, and then back at my wife again, like she was noticing for the first time how rehearsed my wife's emotions were. I set the tablet down on the desk and stepped away from it, because I didn't want the conflict to become a tug of war over a device. I wanted the conflict to become a conversation about choice and consequence, and that conversation works best when nobody can accuse you of provoking. I told them I had not gone looking for anything until my wife invited a divorce committee into our house, and I told them I had only looked at what was already shared in the household. I said it plainly, without anger, because anger would let them dismiss me as a bitter man. Then I said the part that mattered, the part my wife didn't want in the room. This wasn't about me being left. This was about them being lied to. My wife's jaw set hard, and she tried to pivot again by turning the focus onto my behavior, claiming I had been cold and distant, claiming I had driven her to seek comfort. She framed it as emotional neglect, because emotional neglect sounds like a reason, and reasons make betrayal feel like self-care. Marla latched onto that and nodded vigorously, grateful for a narrative that didn't include her own husband. But Tessa didn't nod. Tessa looked at my wife's hands, then at the tablet, then at my wife's phone, because Tessa was now tracking the same thing I had been tracking, patterns and tells. June asked a careful, brutal question, the kind that changes a room permanently. She asked my wife why she had needed them present to announce a divorce, and why she needed them present again now, and why everything had to happen with an audience. My wife's face flashed, and she snapped at June that she needed support, but the snap was too sharp, too revealing, and it made June flinch. That flinch was important, because it meant my wife had just used the wrong tone on the wrong person, and social dynamics hinge on those mistakes. Tessa finally spoke, and her voice was thin but steady. She asked my wife whether Owen had been alone with her in private settings, not at charity events, not in group photos, but in quiet places where nobody could pretend it was normal. My wife opened her mouth, then shut it, then opened it again, and in that hesitation, I saw the same crack I saw earlier when I asked about Glenn. She tried to deny it, but her denial came with too many extra words, too much explanation, too much defensive structure. Tessa's eyes filled with something that wasn't tears yet, just the pressure that comes before tears decide they are allowed. Marla jumped in again, trying to keep the group aligned, saying this was all ridiculous, saying I was poisoning everyone, saying my wife didn't owe anyone details. But Marla's hands were trembling slightly around her phone, and I noticed because I pay attention to details when people start to lose control. Marla had believed she could police the room. Now she was realizing the room was turning on itself. My wife did one last thing to try to regain dominance. She told them I had threatened her. She didn't say the word threaten directly at first. She implied it with phrases about feeling unsafe and needing witnesses. But the intent was clear. She wanted them to remember this night as a night they had to protect her from me, not a night they started asking questions about their husbands. She wanted her safety story to overwrite their betrayal story. It was clever in a sick way because it forced them to choose which fear they wanted to feel more. I let her finish, then I asked her to describe the threat in specific words, with a date and a statement of what I allegedly said or did, because specifics are poison to fabricated narratives. She couldn't do it. She tried, but she drifted into feelings again, and feelings are not facts. June watched her struggle and looked suddenly exhausted, like a person realizing they had been drafted into a war they didn't understand. Tessa's face hardened, because even a loyal friend can recognize when someone is trying to use fear as a shield. I picked up my phone and opened the neighborhood group chat message my wife had triggered earlier, and I showed it to the three women, not to shame my wife, but to demonstrate the pattern. She escalated through other people the moment she felt cornered. I told them, calmly, that this was why I would no longer do anything verbally, and that I would no longer participate in private arguments without documentation. I set it like a boundary, not a threat, because boundaries are lawful and threats are punishable. My wife stared at me with an expression that mixed rage and panic, because for the first time the room wasn't obeying her. Marla looked at my wife like she was recalculating loyalty. June looked at the floor and then back up, as if she wished she could rewind time and walk away before the first smirk. Tessa stood very still and asked quietly whether she could see the mailroom photo again. I turned the tablet back on, scrolled to the condo mailroom image and held it up at a comfortable distance so she could see the timestamp clearly. Tessa stared at it for several seconds, and then she said something that made my wife's posture stiffen like a snapped wire. She said that Owen had told her he was at a late meeting that same day, and he had come home smelling like coffee he didn't drink. She said it slowly, like she was tasting each word for poison. My wife tried to speak, but her voice faltered, and June's eyes widened as the implications landed, because Glenn and Owen were not vague strangers anymore. They were real husbands, with real alibis that matched my wife's patterns. Tessa's hands shook as she unlocked her phone, and Marla's dead smile was gone completely as she did the same. And in that moment, I understood the divorce committee had just turned into something else entirely. Because now, it wasn't my wife judging me in front of her friends. It was 3 wives realizing they might have married the wrong men, and my wife was standing in the center of the blast radius. Tessa's phone screen reflected in her eyes like a small, cruel sunrise, and I could see she wasn't texting for comfort. She was texting for confirmation, the kind that either saves your sanity or shatters it. Marla's fingers moved too, faster and sharper because her instinct wasn't grief, it was control, and control always reaches for the nearest lever. June held her phone but didn't type yet, because June was the kind of person who wants to believe in decency, even when decency has already packed its bags. My wife watched all 3 of them at once, and her body language shifted from confident to tactical, like a driver feeling the road go slick and adjusting before the skid becomes visible. She tried to smile again, that soft, reassurance smile, but it didn't land anymore, because the room had changed its rules. 10 minutes ago, the rules were simple. I was the problem, and she was the victim with witnesses. Now the rules were unclear, and unclear rules terrify people who survive on scripts. Tessa's message must have delivered because she flinched slightly, then stared at her screen with a frozen concentration, and I recognized that look from my own life. The moment you are waiting for the lie to either hold or collapse. Marla, still desperate to keep the group aligned, started talking in a soothing tone, saying everyone should calm down, saying we shouldn't jump to conclusions, saying a photo doesn't prove anything. It was the kind of soothing that was actually a muzzle, because it wasn't meant to comfort Tessa, it was meant to stop Tessa from asking the next question out loud. June finally moved, stepping away from my wife as if she needed space to breathe, and she walked toward the window near the living room, staring outside like the street might offer a clean answer. My wife took that moment to come at me indirectly again, turning her body so she was facing them while still addressing me, and she said we needed to stop this, because I was trying to ruin her life. The phrasing was a tell, because she didn't say I was lying, she said I was ruining, and ruining is what people say when the truth is too loud to deny. I kept my posture neutral, because neutrality was now my only weapon that couldn't be taken away. And I told them I wasn't asking anyone to believe me on faith. I told them to check their own timelines, their own messages, their own calendars, and their own memories, because affairs don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in missed dinners, late arrivals, sudden showers, and phone screens turned downward like a guilty reflex. I didn't say it with drama. I said it like a person giving directions, because that's what it was, a map out of the fog. My wife stepped toward me then, close enough that the other women could see she was trying to intimidate without touching, and she lowered her voice so it sounded intimate, like she was trying to reason with me privately. She said I was making a huge mistake. She said I would regret it. She said everyone would hate me for doing this. She said I didn't understand how things work in our community, as if community were a courtroom she already owned. I looked at her calmly and told her she had already chosen public, and now public would answer back. The first reply arrived on Tessa's phone, and the shift in her face was immediate, like someone had opened a window in a smoke-filled room and realized the air outside was colder than expected. She didn't speak right away because sometimes the body needs a second to translate proof into pain, but her eyes lifted to my wife with a new focus, and in that focus, I saw something stronger than anger. I saw clarity. Marla noticed the change and tried to intercept it, stepping closer to Tessa as if proximity could control output, and she asked what Owen said. Tessa's lips pressed together tightly, and she didn't answer Marla first. She looked at my wife, and then she looked at me, and then she looked back at my wife again, and the triangle of those glances told me everything. Tessa was weighing whether I was a bitter husband trying to lash out, or a man holding a match to a gas leak that already existed. My wife started speaking quickly again, claiming I was manipulating them, claiming I had staged this, claiming I had been planning to split the friend group. She was throwing smoke grenades because she needed confusion to return. She kept saying the word jealous, like it was a diagnosis that could disqualify me from reality. But the more she talked, the more the other women's faces hardened, because rehearsed defensiveness becomes ugly once you see it for what it is. June finally turned from the window and asked carefully whether my wife had ever been alone with Glenn at June's house, at dinners, at any of the little gatherings that were supposed to be safe. My wife's mouth opened, and she tried to answer with a laugh, but the laugh died fast because it wasn't supported by anything anymore. She said she had been alone with him only in normal ways, like helping clean up, like walking to the car, like grabbing supplies. She said it as if the word normal could erase the fact that normal is where affairs hide best. Tessa's phone buzzed again, and this time she made a small, involuntary sound in her throat, like surprise twisting into disgust. She didn't show the screen to anyone yet, but her eyes got wet, and she blinked hard as if refusing permission for tears. Marla's phone buzzed too, almost at the same time, and Marla's face went rigid, then flushed, then pale, cycling through emotions faster than she could control. That was the moment I knew both husbands were responding, and that their responses weren't simple. My wife noticed their reactions and did something subtle but revealing. She backed toward the hallway, not to leave, but to position herself closer to an exit route, because people who think they are innocent don't map exits in their own home. She said she was done with this circus. She said they all needed to leave. She said she didn't want to talk anymore. She said she would call someone if this continued, and her eyes flicked toward my hands as if she were imagining a story where I had raised them. I kept my hands visible, palms relaxed, and I stepped slightly away to remove any physical tension she could later exaggerate. Then I looked at Tessa and asked, gently, whether Owen's reply matched his alibi from that day. My wife snapped that I should stop interrogating people, but I didn't look at my wife. I kept my eyes on Tessa, because this wasn't about my wife's comfort anymore. It was about whether these women were going to walk back into their own lives blind. Tessa finally spoke in a thin voice, and she said Owen claimed he had been at a meeting, but he couldn't name the client, and he couldn't forward the invite, and he was suddenly very angry that she had asked. She said it like a person reading a label on poison. June's hand went to her mouth, because anger in response to a simple question is its own confession. Marla let out a short, bitter laugh, and she said Glenn was refusing to answer at all, and he was demanding she stop embarrassing him, and he was accusing her of being paranoid. My wife tried to jump on that, claiming the husbands were reacting normally to false accusations, claiming the wives were letting my jealousy infect them. But her voice sounded thinner now because each new message was turning her words into dust. I watched June's face as June processed the idea that her husband might be lying, and I saw something shift in June's eyes, a new kind of cold attention. June was not dramatic, but she was smart, and smart people become dangerous when they stop trusting. Marla stepped away from my wife, and that small movement was massive because Marla had arrived as a shield, and now she was stepping out of formation. She demanded to know why my wife's name was showing up in an old location history note Glenn had once mentioned in passing, a silly feature on his phone that had never mattered until now. My wife snapped that she didn't know and didn't care what Glenn's phone did. She said it too fast, and it sounded like panic dressed as arrogance. Tessa's breathing got uneven, and June moved closer to her, placing a hand on Tessa's arm, because whatever community politics existed, the biological truth was stronger. A wife in shock becomes a sister, at least for a moment. Tessa asked my wife, directly now, whether she had ever kissed Owen, whether she had ever crossed a line, whether she had ever looked Tessa in the eyes while hiding that kind of betrayal. My wife's lips pressed tight, and she tried to respond with moral outrage, but the outrage didn't stick because her eyes were doing too much work. I saw her make the decision, and it was almost impressive in its ugliness. She pivoted from denial into blame, because blame is the last refuge of a person whose lies have run out. She said the husbands had wanted it. She said the husbands had chased her. She said she had been lonely, and she said their marriages were already broken. She said it wasn't her fault if these men were unhappy at home. She said it like she was delivering a confession that made her the victim, not the predator. Marla's face contorted with something like nausea, and June whispered an instinctive denial, as if refusing to believe my wife could be that shameless in front of them. Tessa made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and she said she had defended my wife for years. She said she had told Owen my wife was safe. She said she had trusted her in her own house. My wife tried to speak again, to soften it, to backpedal, but the damage was already done. Then my wife made her biggest mistake of the night. She looked at me with pure hatred and said this was what I always did, that I always ruined things for her, that I couldn't stand seeing her admired. It was a revealing line because it admitted the engine under everything. She wanted admiration more than truth, more than loyalty, more than partnership. She wanted an audience, and she wanted control of what the audience believed. I let a short silence sit after that, because silence lets people hear the shape of a confession. Then I told the room something that felt almost boring, but boring is where justice lives. I told them I had screenshots with timestamps. I told them I had the bank notification time from my own account. I told them I had the shared photo metadata. I told them I wasn't going to argue about feelings anymore. I told them that if they wanted to know whether they were being lied to, they should ask for one concrete thing from their husbands tonight. A forwarding of the meeting invite, a receipt, a calendar entry, something real. If the men refused, that refusal would answer more loudly than any rumor. My wife turned sharply toward the hallway, and I realized she was going to retrieve something, maybe a bag, maybe her phone charger, maybe a folder, maybe just an excuse to breathe alone and plan the next lie. But as she moved, her elbow knocked the edge of the kitchen table where the paperwork sat, and one sheet slid out onto the floor like a card that wanted to be seen. It was a printed list of appointments, names, and times, and it didn't look like household logistics at all. June bent down faster than anyone else and picked it up before my wife could, and when June's eyes scanned the page, her face went completely still, the way a person looks when they have just found the trapdoor under the room, because at the top of the page, in a neat, bold header, was the title of a women's divorce support circle, and beneath it were the names of my wife's friends, and beneath their names were private meeting times that didn't match any of the stories they had told their husbands. June held the page like it was contaminated, keeping it between two fingers as she read, and the longer her eyes stayed on the header, the more her face emptied of warmth. She did not ask what it was, because the title had already answered that, and she did not look at my wife right away, because she needed one more second to accept that the betrayal had come with schedules and coordination. The paper was clean, neatly printed, and organized by names and times, which meant someone had planned for this to be repeated, not confessed. My wife moved fast, stepping toward June with a hand already extended, but she tried to make it look casual, like she was merely taking back a private document that had been misunderstood. June didn't hand it over. June turned her wrist slightly, keeping the page out of reach, and she asked, in a voice that was strangely calm, why her name was on a list for a divorce circle she had never agreed to join. My wife answered too quickly, and her answer came with too many protective words about support and empowerment and safe spaces, which only confirmed the truth. This had been built like a program, not a reaction. Tessa stared at the page and then at my wife, and the look on her face was almost childlike in its disbelief, because nobody wants to believe their friend created a whole system to make betrayal feel normal. Marla's mouth tightened into a thin line, and she asked whether this circle was what the living room divorce announcement had been, a rehearsal for getting rid of husbands without consequences. My wife tried to pivot again, saying it wasn't about getting rid of anyone, it was about women taking control of their lives, but she could not say it without sounding like someone selling a product they don't fully understand. I walked to the table and picked up my phone, not to record their pain, but to preserve the fact that the paper existed and that it was found in my home, because the next phase of every coordinated lie is denial. I asked June to hold the page steady, and I photographed it with the kitchen clock in the background. Then I took a second photo with the date on my phone visible, and then a third photo of my wife's reach toward it. My wife saw the camera and froze, and her face flickered with something close to panic, because panic is what happens when a manipulator realizes the room now belongs to documentation. June handed the page to Tessa instead of my wife, and that single choice was a betrayal inside the betrayal, a friend choosing truth over allegiance. Tessa's hands shook as she read, and I noticed her breathing change again, quick and shallow, the way it did when she got the messages from Owen. Marla leaned in, reading over Tessa's shoulder, and her eyes widened in a sharp, ugly way when she saw the list of meeting times, because those times were not random. Those times matched the nights their husbands had meetings, the nights the men came home late, the nights excuses showed up with rehearsed phrases. My wife tried to take control of the room with volume, but volume only works when people are still uncertain, and uncertainty had just been replaced by a printed schedule. She told them they were overreacting. She told them I had planted it. She told them I was twisting normal support into something sinister. She used my name as if naming me would restore her authority, but the women barely looked at me now, because I was no longer the center of their fear. Their fear had moved to their own houses, and that fear had teeth. June said something that made my wife's posture stiffen, because it was a line only a smart woman would think to say when the ground shifts. June said she wanted to know who organized the circle, who attended, and what exactly was discussed about their husbands. My wife tried to shrug it off, but she could not hide the fact that she knew the answers. She hesitated. Then she said the meetings were private and nobody owed anyone details, and that sentence landed like a confession. Private meetings are not private when they are used to coordinate public humiliation. I told them I wasn't going to keep them in my home while they fought, not because I wanted to protect my wife, but because this house was now a contested stage, and stages are where people get hurt in ways they later deny. I asked them to leave, not as an order, but as a boundary, and I said that if they wanted the photos and timestamps I had already seen, I would provide copies. My wife laughed sharply and accused me of trying to control the narrative, but June ignored her and nodded once, as if grateful that someone in the room could still think in steps. Tessa and June moved toward the door together, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and it hit me then how quickly women can become allies when the threat is shared. Marla followed last, and before she stepped outside, she looked back at my wife with a level stare that contained more disappointment than fury. Marla did not apologize to my wife, and she did not comfort her either. She simply left, and the absence of her usual smirk was its own verdict. When the door closed, the house felt too quiet, the way it feels after a storm when you realize what the wind has torn loose. My wife stood near the entryway, rigid and furious, and she told me I had just destroyed her friendships. I told her she destroyed them the moment she turned trust into a schedule. She snapped that I didn't understand women, and I said that was convenient, because she didn't understand consequences. She moved toward the kitchen again, and this time she went straight for the drawer where the paperwork sat, as if she wanted to scoop everything into a bag and vanish into a friend's guest room with a story already prepared. I stepped into her path without touching her, just occupying space, and I told her I would not stop her from leaving, but I would not allow her to take documents that belonged to both of us, especially when she had already shown she would weaponize anything that could confuse a timeline. She glared at me and said I was acting like her jailer, and that word was deliberate, because she was building her next accusation in real time. I kept my voice even and told her she could take her personal items, her clothing, and anything that was clearly hers, but the household documents stayed until a legal process decided otherwise. She tried to push past me with her shoulder, not hard enough to call it violence, but hard enough to test whether she could trigger a reaction. I didn't react. I simply stepped back, let her pass, and then I walked to the table and began doing the most boring thing in the world. I created a ledger. I took a blank sheet, wrote the date, wrote what happened, wrote who was present, and wrote that a printed divorce circle schedule was found in my home and photographed. I signed the bottom. The act of writing seemed to irritate her more than any insult, because writing makes a story durable. My wife watched me with narrowed eyes, and she said I was making this into a war. I told her she made it a war when she brought an audience to announce my removal. She said I was punishing her. I told her punishment would be chaos, and I wasn't interested in chaos. I said I was interested in clarity, and clarity would arrive one document at a time. That sentence made her flinch, because clarity is the one thing her circle could not tolerate. She disappeared down the hallway and started opening drawers, slamming them with controlled force, the kind designed to sound dramatic without crossing a line. I stayed at the table and printed 2 photos from the tablet onto our home printer. Not the intimate ones, not anything obscene, only the ones with clear timestamps and public settings, because public settings are what hold up when stories get challenged. I wrote the date on the back of each printout and signed them. Then I placed them in clear sleeves from the folder we used for home insurance paperwork. My wife returned to the kitchen carrying a bag and stopped when she saw the sleeves, because sleeves looked like evidence, and evidence looked like a future she couldn't bluff her way through. She asked what I planned to do with that. I told her I planned to respond to whatever she tried next. She said she would file and take everything from me. I told her she could file, and she could ask, and the process would decide, but she would not do it through smirks and group chats anymore. She scoffed and said the courts favor women. I told her the courts favor documentation, and she had spent months living in the opposite. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a flash of relief, like a drowning person seeing a rope. She started typing again. I didn't ask who she was texting. I didn't demand her phone. I simply noted the time on my ledger and wrote that she began messaging immediately after the confrontation ended. That detail mattered, because coordinated people always regroup quickly, and regrouping leaves patterns. A minute later, my own phone buzzed with a notification I recognized, not a text, but an email. The subject line made my throat tighten, not from fear, but from the cold confirmation that she was already moving the fight into institutions. The subject line read, "Meeting request, workplace conduct concern." And the sender was someone I had never contacted before, a neutral address that told me she wasn't just fighting for divorce. She was fighting for the story that would make me the villain in every room that mattered. I stared at the email subject line long enough for the words to stop being words and become an intention, and the intention was simple. She wasn't trying to win a divorce. She was trying to win the story. A workplace conduct concern is a neat little knife because it cuts quietly, it bleeds slowly, and by the time people notice the damage, the accused is already defensive, already sweating, already guilty in the eyes of anyone who prefers safety over fairness. I did not open it right away, because panic reading is how you start reacting instead of building a response, and I had learned that my wife's whole method depended on dragging me into emotional motion. I wrote the time down on my ledger first, then I wrote the sender name, then I wrote the subject line exactly as it appeared, because I wanted the sequence preserved before my mind tried to soften it. Then I opened it and read it once, slowly, letting the tone sink in, because tone tells you what kind of game is being played. The message requested a meeting with my supervisor and an HR representative to discuss concerns that had been raised, and it included a line about creating a safe workplace environment, and it included another line about confidentiality, which is how institutions remind you they can speak about you without you speaking back. There were no details, no date of the alleged incident, no specific behavior, only the vague fog of concern, and that vagueness wasn't accidental. Vague accusations force you to fill in blanks, and the moment you fill in blanks, you create a narrative your enemies can later quote. I looked down the hallway and saw my wife in the bedroom doorway, watching me with a kind of satisfied stillness, as if she could already taste how it would feel to see me shrink under suspicion. She didn't ask what the email was. She didn't have to. The timing was too clean. She had left the room to regroup, she had texted, and now an institution had reached into my pocket with its hand out. I stood up, walked to the pantry, and took out the small lockbox where I kept our household paperwork, not because I was hiding money or planning anything dramatic, but because paperwork is the only language coordinated people respect. I placed the lockbox on the table, opened it, and set out the sleeves I had already prepared, the printed photos with timestamps, the written ledger pages, and the photograph of the divorce circle schedule with the kitchen clock in frame. I did it slowly and calmly, making the house feel like an office, because my wife's preferred battlefield was emotion, and I wanted the battlefield to become procedure. She came into the kitchen with her bag still half-packed, and she asked what I thought I was doing, using that tone that implies you're behaving irrationally even while you're sitting still. I told her I was preparing for the next lie. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I nodded once because denials are easy when they cost nothing, and I told her she was free to leave whenever she wanted, but she was not free to set my life on fire and call it self-care. She scoffed and said nobody would believe me because she had friends, because she had support, because she had witnesses, and she said it like that word still mattered after what had happened. I didn't argue about belief. I told her that beliefs change when documents arrive, and documents were already arriving. That last part made her eyes tighten, because she had expected me to be desperate, not organized. I took a second to call a colleague from work, not to ask for favors, not to pull strings, but to confirm something basic about process, because process is where you survive these things. I asked what the standard practice was for a conduct concern meeting, whether I could request details in writing ahead of time, and whether I could bring a written timeline of events that might be relevant. The colleague told me the simplest truth, the one institutions always hide behind. Ask for specifics, stay calm, document everything, and do not improvise explanations in the room. I wrote down the time of the call and the general advice in my ledger, because advice becomes a memory, and memory becomes slippery when someone is trying to force you into a corner. My wife watched me take notes, and her mouth pulled into something like irritation, because she couldn't provoke me into the spectacle she needed. She wanted raised voices, slammed doors, a clip she could replay to an audience as proof of my instability. Instead, she had a man making neat lines on paper, and neat lines on paper are hard to turn into a villain. I emailed HR back with a short reply, asking for the date range of the alleged conduct, the nature of the concern in plain terms, and whether any specific policy was being referenced, and I asked it in polite, neutral language that left no room for emotional interpretation. I also requested that the meeting be scheduled at a time when I could prepare, and that I would attend with a written statement, because the goal was not to argue, the goal was to enter the record. I didn't mention my wife, I didn't mention the affair, I didn't mention the living room ambush. I simply asked for clarity, because clarity is what liars fear most. When I hit send, my wife's phone buzzed again, and I watched her face as she read, because she couldn't hide the little shifts anymore. She was receiving feedback from someone, and the feedback was changing her mood from smug to tense. She looked up at me and said I was making her look bad, and that line alone told me the motive behind everything. She wasn't afraid of losing me. She was afraid of losing face. She started listing grievances in that rehearsed way, blaming me for being cold, blaming me for being distant, blaming me for making her feel invisible, and she said it as if emotional dissatisfaction were a permit for betrayal. I didn't tell her she was wrong, because arguing about feelings is how you get trapped in endless loops. I told her that if she wanted to leave, she could leave, and if she wanted a divorce, she could file, but she would not use my work to punish me for refusing to accept a public humiliation. She stepped closer and said I was threatening her again, and she did it with a tiny glance toward her own phone, as if she were imagining a future version of this moment being described to someone else. I kept my hands visible, my voice low, and I said that if she felt unsafe, she should leave immediately, because the safest distance between us was a closed door. She hesitated, because she didn't want to leave without taking control of the exit narrative, but she also didn't want to stay if staying meant she might be forced into documented calm. She went to the bedroom and returned with a larger bag, and she began taking items from the hallway closet, and I did not stop her, because the quickest path to being called controlling is to physically block a person who already enjoys calling you controlling. Instead, I stayed at the table and wrote the time she began removing items and the items she took that were clearly hers. I did it like an inventory, because inventories are neutral, and neutrality is lethal to manipulation. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again, and I expected another HR message, but it wasn't HR. It was a notification from our shared account, a merchant alert on a card I owned, and the merchant name made my stomach tighten in a different way. It was a boutique hotel near downtown, and the charge was a small deposit amount that looked like a hold, the kind of pre-authorization that comes before a night that never happened according to the story you were given. I didn't accuse her. I didn't even look up right away. I took a screenshot, noted the exact time, and wrote the merchant name and amount into my ledger. Then I stood, walked to the doorway, and asked her calmly whether she had any reason to be booking a hotel while telling everyone the divorce was already decided. She froze mid-motion, and her mouth opened as if she would say traffic or stress or needing space, but her eyes flicked away because the alert had cornered her in a place feelings couldn't protect. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I held up my phone with the alert visible, not shoved toward her face, just present, like a fact in the air. She stared at it for a fraction of a second too long, and that was all I needed because innocent people don't study alerts like they are puzzles. She said the card must have been compromised. She said I was paranoid. She said I was monitoring her. She said all the words that create fog. I told her I wasn't interested in fog, and I wasn't interested in theories, and I asked her one plain thing, whether she had used that card for any purchase in the last 48 hours. She said no, too fast, and then she corrected herself by saying maybe she had bought something small for the house, because she couldn't keep the lie stable. I wrote down the inconsistency, not with emotion, but with a simple note. Denial shifted to partial admission within 10 seconds. Her phone buzzed again, and she looked at it, and her shoulders rose slightly in a defensive shrug, as if preparing to tell someone that I was interrogating her. I realized then that her exit was not about leaving a marriage, it was about leaving with a packaged accusation, something clean enough to repeat. The HR email was the first shove. The hotel alert was the first slip. And slips are where truth lives. She said she was going to stay with a friend, and she said it like a final sentence, something meant to end the conversation. I nodded and said she should. I told her to take what she needed and go, and I said it without sarcasm, because sarcasm would give her a quote to weaponize. She stood there, waiting for me to beg, waiting for me to explode, waiting for me to do something that would justify the conduct concern. When I didn't, her face tightened with frustration, and she walked out. The door closed, and the house became still again. But it wasn't peace. It was the quiet between moves in a longer game. I sat back down and opened my calendar, not to stalk her, not to chase her, but to map my own next 30 days like a man planning for weather. I had an HR meeting pending. I had a household in collapse. I had 3 other marriages now shaking in the background, and that meant the rumor pipeline would soon erupt. I added a simple reminder for myself to print my HR reply and staple it to the front of my ledger pages, because the first rule of surviving a smear is keeping your own record cleaner than theirs. Then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from June, short and heavy, saying that Owen was not coming home tonight, and that Tessa had found a second hotel charge on their account. And right after June's message, another email landed in my inbox, this one from a community address I recognized too well, announcing an emergency HOA hearing about household disturbances and resident safety concerns, scheduled for the end of the week. My wife hadn't just taken the fight to my workplace. She had taken it to the people who live close enough to watch my front door. The HOA email read like a weather warning written by someone who enjoys storms, and the worst part was the vague phrasing, because vague phrasing lets people pour their fears into the empty space. It claimed there had been disturbances, it mentioned resident safety concerns, and it insisted on a hearing, which is how small neighborhoods pretend they are courts without the burden of proof. I sat at my kitchen table with my ledger open, and I realized my wife had picked the one arena where gossip becomes policy faster than truth becomes obvious. I did not respond with anger, because anger is oxygen for this kind of system, and I did not respond with panic, because panic looks like guilt. I replied with the same neutral language I used with HR, asking for the time and date of each alleged incident, the specific rule being invoked, and whether any complaint was submitted in writing with a name attached. I asked for the meeting to include the HOA secretary who would record minutes, because the moment something is typed, it becomes harder to twist later. Then I printed the email chain, wrote the date on the back, and slipped it into a clear sleeve, because my wife's strategy depended on me staying informal while she went formal. My phone buzzed again with a message from Tessa, and I could tell she had been crying just from the clipped, uneven way she wrote. She said Owen was refusing to show receipts, refusing to explain the hotel charge, and accusing her of being manipulated by me, which was almost funny if it wasn't so ugly. June followed with her own message, saying she had checked her shared calendar and found a committee meeting entry that had been deleted after the fact, and she only knew because her phone had shown a preview earlier that week. I told them both the same thing, not as advice, but as a lifeline. Take screenshots now, write down times, and do not argue in circles with men who are already rehearsed. By late afternoon, the neighborhood started acting different, and it was subtle enough that only someone paying attention would notice. The mail carrier's smile was thinner. A neighbor who usually waved suddenly remembered an urgent errand. 2 teenagers on bikes slowed down near my driveway like they were collecting a scene for someone else. It felt like the area around my house had become a bulletin board, and my wife had pinned a story there with bright red tape. I stepped outside and checked my own front entry camera. Not for drama, not for a miracle clip, but to confirm that my reality matched the rumor being sold. The footage showed nothing except normal life, the occasional package delivery, and my wife leaving earlier with her bags without any confrontation in the doorway. I took a still frame from the moment she walked out, timestamp visible, because it mattered that she left freely and calmly, and I saved it in a folder on my phone with the date in the name. Then I wrote the file name into my ledger, because files are easy to misplace when your nervous system is busy surviving. The HOA meeting was set for the clubhouse, a beige room with folding chairs and a cheap podium, the kind of place where people pretend they are serious while wearing sneakers. I arrived early, not to intimidate anyone, but to remove the power of their stagecraft, and I sat in the second row where I could see the board and the door. The HOA president, a man named Carter Hale, stood near the front with that practiced expression people wear when they enjoy being in charge of small consequences. He wasn't police, he wasn't a judge, but he loved the posture of authority, and my wife had chosen him because he would never let a good scandal go to waste. A few neighbors trickled in, and their eyes kept sliding to me as if I might start shouting on cue, because that is what people expect when they have been primed. I nodded politely to anyone who met my gaze, because politeness is not weakness. It is a trap for liars, since liars need you to misbehave. The HOA secretary sat at a small table with a laptop open, fingers poised over keys, and I felt a small, grim relief, because typed minutes are the closest thing to fairness a room like this can produce. Carter opened the meeting with a lecture about community values, safety, and respect, and it sounded like a sermon written by someone who never had to practice it. He said there had been disturbances at my residence, and that multiple people had expressed concern, and he said it slowly, enjoying the weight of the accusation. I raised my hand, waited to be acknowledged, and asked, calmly, for the dates and times of those disturbances, and for the specific rule being cited. He blinked once, because he had expected me to either apologize or explode, and a request for specificity is the one response that ruins theatrical momentum. He said the board had received reports of shouting and domestic instability, and he said it as if those words were facts rather than rumors. I asked whether any report included an audio clip, a written log, or a named witness willing to attach their name to the claim. He bristled and said the HOA protects residents from retaliation, which was an elegant way of saying the accusations were anonymous, because anonymity is safer than accountability. I nodded and said I understood. Then I asked that the minutes reflect that the allegations were anonymous and not supported by objective evidence. The secretary paused, looked up, then typed, and Carter's jaw tightened as he watched the room become a record. That was when my wife arrived, and she did it like an actress who believes the crowd owes her sympathy. She walked in with two of her friends, neither of whom had been at my house earlier, and she sat in the front row as if she belonged to the board. She looked back at me once with a careful expression of sadness, the kind people use when they are pre-selling a narrative of victimhood. I didn't react. I just noted the time on my watch and wrote it down in my notebook, because every performance has an entrance, and entrances matter. Carter invited concerned residents to speak, and my wife raised her hand, which was almost comedic, because she had moved from planning divorce announcements on my couch to presenting herself as a worried neighbor. She described me as unstable, controlling, and threatening, and she did it with a tone designed to sound sincere, which is the oldest trick in the book. She claimed she had been forced to leave for her safety, that she had been pushed out, that she had nowhere to go, and she let her voice tremble on purpose to make the room lean toward her. When Carter asked whether she had documentation, she hesitated, then said she had messages and friends who witnessed things, and she gestured vaguely toward the women beside her. I raised my hand again and asked that she specify what was witnessed, on what date, and in what location, and I asked that the minutes reflect that her claims were based on feelings and unnamed messages, not documented events. Carter tried to shut me down by calling me combative, but I kept my tone even and said I was asking procedural questions, not attacking anyone. The secretary typed again, and I could see my wife's confidence flicker, because her power was always strongest when she could speak without being pinned to dates. Carter then tried a new angle, saying the HOA could issue a warning, impose fines, or require a behavior agreement, which sounded like a leash disguised as a form. He said it was about de-escalation, but it was really about control, and he liked saying it in front of a crowd. I asked for the rule that authorized such an agreement for anonymous claims, and I asked whether the HOA had authority over marital disputes, and I asked it politely enough that the room could not call it aggression. Carter looked at the secretary, then back at me, and his eyes showed the irritation of a man who had expected submission and got homework instead. I slid one clear sleeve across the aisle to the secretary, not to make a speech, not to humiliate my wife, but to enter facts into the room. The sleeve contained the time-stamped still frame of my wife leaving the house calmly, the printed HOA email chain showing my request for specifics, and a one-page timeline of the last 48 hours written in simple language. I asked the secretary to note in the minutes that I had provided a time-stamped record of my wife leaving voluntarily and a written request for specific allegations. Carter tried to block it by saying the board would review materials privately, but I asked that the minutes reflect whether evidence was accepted or refused. The secretary typed the line, and Carter's control slipped another inch. My wife leaned toward Carter and whispered something, and the whisper itself was revealing. Because she wasn't a witness, she was a strategist. Carter cleared his throat and said the board would recess for 5 minutes to review the submitted materials. People in the room began murmuring, and I could feel the gossip engine trying to rewrite itself in real time because now the narrative had to account for paperwork. During the recess, one neighbor I barely knew approached me with a cautious look and said, quietly, that there had been rumors about my wife spending time with different men in the neighborhood and that he hadn't believed them until today. He didn't offer names. He didn't offer drama. He offered the one thing that matters in places like this, a neutral voice, acknowledging the rumor existed before my wife tried to weaponize it against me. I asked him gently if he would be willing to state that in one sentence if asked, and he said he would answer truthfully if the board questioned him directly. I wrote, "Neutral neighbor willing to confirm rumor existed," in my notebook without any embellishment, because even a small truth can collapse a large lie later. When the board returned, Carter's voice was tighter, and he announced that no fines would be issued at this time, but that the situation would be monitored, which was a coward's compromise. He suggested we pursue mediation, and he said it as if he were doing me a favor, but I knew what he really meant. He wanted the HOA to stay involved so it could keep feeding on the spectacle. I agreed to civil mediation if required by any legal process, and I asked that the minutes reflect that I had requested evidence and that none was provided beyond verbal claims. The secretary typed, and I watched my wife's jaw clench as she realized she hadn't gotten the public punishment she came to collect. As the meeting ended, my wife stood and looked at me like she was waiting for me to approach her, like she wanted a hallway confrontation she could later describe with tears. I stayed seated until she left the room. I let her audience dissolve first. I let the stage go dark. Then I gathered my sleeves and my notebook and walked out without looking at anyone who wanted a reaction. Outside, my phone buzzed with a new message from June, and it was short enough to feel like a punch. She said Marla had just texted her a screenshot of a private group chat, and in that chat my wife was telling the other wives exactly what to claim at the HOA hearing, down to the words unsafe and forced out, like it was a script. And June added one line at the end that made my stomach drop into something colder than anger. She said the chat also mentioned a second meeting tomorrow, and it wasn't about divorce anymore. It was about taking my job next. I sat in my car outside the clubhouse for a full minute, hands on the wheel, watching neighbors drift away in pairs, because people never walk alone after a good scandal. They walk together so they can rehearse the same version, and the version that wins is always the one repeated first. My wife and her two shadows crossed the lot like they owned the asphalt, and I let them go without a glance, because she wanted the hallway scene, the last-minute flair, the little clip she could quote later as proof that I was unstable. I gave her nothing except distance, and distance has a way of turning actors into amateurs. When I got home, the house felt smaller than it had that morning, like the walls had moved in to listen, and I hated that I could feel her fingerprints in the air even when she was gone. I went straight to the kitchen table, opened my ledger, and wrote down the meeting start and end times, Carter Hale's refusal to cite a specific incident, and the secretary's typed notes about anonymous complaints. I added one line about my wife presenting herself as a concerned resident, because that detail mattered, since it proved she wasn't fleeing a threat, she was running a campaign. Then I set the clear sleeves in a neat row, because neat rows are how you remind yourself you still control at least one thing. My phone buzzed, and June's name appeared, followed by a file attachment that loaded slowly, like even my signal wanted to delay the bad news. It was a screenshot of a private group chat, and the first thing I noticed was the title of the chat, because people always choose titles that make their intentions sound noble. It was something like Fresh Start Sisters, and beneath it were lines of coached language, suggested phrases, and a little checklist of emotions to perform. My wife had written most of it, and she had written it with the same confident tone she used on my couch when she told me they had decided it was time to divorce me. The screenshot showed her instructing the other women to use the same words at the HOA hearing, to repeat unsafe, forced out, and controlling, and to avoid specifics because specifics can be disproved. It also showed her telling them to contact my workplace with concerns and to say they were worried I might retaliate if confronted directly. There was a small note about timing, a suggestion to hit HR before I could prepare, and that note made my teeth grind because it confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't improvising, she was coordinating. I did not forward the screenshot to anyone immediately, because forwarding can create a chain of custody problem when people start deleting and denying. Instead, I took my own screenshots of June's message thread, showing when she sent it. Then I saved the image to a folder with today's date. Then I printed it. Then I signed the back of the printout with the time, because my wife's favorite move was to claim everything was fabricated after the fact. I stapled the printout to a blank page and wrote, in plain English, who sent it, when it arrived, and what it depicted. And I kept the description simple, because simple descriptions survive cross-examination better than rage. June called 10 minutes later, and her voice sounded raw, like she had been crying and then decided to stop because crying wasn't solving anything. She told me Marla had finally snapped after seeing the hotel charges and realizing the so-called divorce circle had always been cover. Marla had confronted her husband. He had panicked, and panic had turned into anger, which is how guilty people try to regain control. Marla had then confronted my wife by phone, and my wife had responded with an icy calm that sounded like a woman used to getting away with coordinated betrayals. June said Marla took that calm as proof, and she sent the screenshot to June because she didn't want it traced back to her yet. I listened without interrupting because people tell the truth more clearly when you let them finish, and when June finally stopped speaking, I asked one question that mattered. I asked whether Marla was willing to say, if needed, that the screenshot came from her phone and her group chat, and that she recognized my wife's writing style. June said Marla was furious enough to do anything, but she was scared enough to hesitate, because fear is what your wife buys with every smear she launches. I told June I wasn't asking Marla to fight a public war, only to be prepared to confirm a fact if an institution demanded it. June said she would talk to her, and I wrote down the call time and the summary in my ledger, because calls become foggy in memory, and fog is where liars live. That night, I slept in short, broken fragments, waking every hour with my jaw clenched, and each time I woke, I checked my email, not because I wanted drama, but because I expected another institutional hook to land. By morning, the HR meeting request had been rescheduled for the next day, and there was still no detail, still no clear allegation, only the phrase concerns raised. I reread my own neutral reply and felt a grim satisfaction, because at least my language couldn't be quoted against me without making the other side look vague and manipulative. I spent the morning building something boring and lethal, a one-page timeline, I kept it clean, typed and factual, with dates, times, and sources, and I attached nothing that came from illegal access or private snooping. I listed the divorce announcement in my home with witnesses present. I listed the HOA hearing and the anonymous complaint issue. I listed the HR email subject line and my written request for specifics. I listed the shared account merchant alert for the hotel deposit and noted that I had not accused anyone, only documented it. Then I added a final line that changed the whole shape of the conflict because it showed intent, not emotion. A screenshot of a group chat coaching witnesses to use scripted phrases and contact my workplace. I printed 3 copies of the timeline and slid them into clear sleeves, and I labeled each sleeve with the date using a black marker, because messy labeling makes people think you're messy. Then I placed the sleeves into a plain folder and put the folder in my work bag like it was a routine document, because the worst thing you can do in a formal meeting is arrive looking like you are carrying a vendetta. I wasn't bringing revenge. I was bringing clarity. The afternoon brought another message from Tessa, and her text was shorter than usual, which told me she was trying not to cry again. She said Owen had finally admitted there were mistakes, but he was insisting my wife had pressured him, that it had been a lapse, that he was scared, and that he wanted to fix it. Tessa said that when she asked for details, he kept repeating the same phrases, like he had been coached to stay vague. That detail hit me like a cold splash, because it matched the group chat instructions, and it confirmed the pattern. The husbands were following scripts, and the scripts were designed to prevent timelines from forming. I asked Tessa to screenshot any message where Owen used repeated phrasing, especially if it matched anything in the group chat. I asked her to write down, on paper, the dates of the hotel charges, and any nights he claimed he was elsewhere, because paper doesn't vanish when someone deletes a thread. She said she would, and I wrote down her message time, because every piece of this needed to be anchored. I wasn't collecting gossip for entertainment. I was building a bridge between betrayal and consequence. By evening, June sent a second screenshot, and this one made my skin prickle. It showed my wife telling the women that if HR asked for specifics, they should say they were afraid to write details down. She literally instructed them to weaponize fear as a shield against verification. Underneath her message was a reply from one of the women asking, "What if he shows proof?" And my wife's answer was a neat little poison. Say it is staged, say he is obsessive, say he is controlling, and let the institution handle it. She wasn't just betraying me, she was teaching others how to betray truth. I printed the second screenshot and added it to the folder. Then I opened a fresh page in my ledger and wrote, in plain language, what the screenshots demonstrated: coordination, scripting, and intent to create institutional harm. I did not write anything about her character, because character arguments get dismissed. I wrote about behaviors, because behaviors can be documented. Then I wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page that made my hands steady again. I will not argue. I will enter facts into the record. Late that night, there was a knock at my door, and when I checked the peephole, I saw Carter Hale standing there, hands in his pockets, smiling like a man who had found a new hobby. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain on, because chains aren't for fear, they're for clarity, and I asked what he wanted. He said the board wanted to check in and make sure everything was calm, and he said it like he was offering kindness, but his eyes were doing inventory. I told him everything was calm, and I asked whether his check-in was a formal HOA action or a personal visit. He hesitated, then said it was informal, which meant it was unrecorded, which meant it could be described later however he wanted. I nodded and told him that if the HOA needed anything, it could be emailed to me, and that I preferred written communication for accuracy. His smile tightened, because men like Carter do not like being forced into paper, and he told me I was making things difficult. I told him I was making them clear. Then I closed the door. I didn't sleep much after that, because now I knew the smear wasn't limited to my wife's circle. It had expanded into the petty power structure around us, and petty power structures hate being denied access to your private life. Still, the next morning arrived, and with it came an email from HR confirming the meeting time and location, finally including one concrete detail. The meeting would be held in a small conference room adjacent to the main floor, and a community representative would be present to provide context. A community representative was not standard workplace procedure. It was a weapon, dressed up as a witness. I stared at the email, felt the shape of the trap forming, and realized my wife wasn't trying to convince HR I was wrong. She was trying to stage a public verdict where I couldn't fight back, and she had just invited my neighborhood into my career. I arrived at the office early enough that the lobby still smelled like cleaning solution and false optimism, and I took that as a good sign because it meant nobody had time to rehearse a crowd reaction yet. I walked in with a plain folder, a quiet face, and the kind of posture that makes people assume you already know something they do not, which is useful when you are about to be accused of everything except breathing correctly. The receptionist looked up, then looked down, then looked up again, because my name had probably been floating around in someone's inbox all night like a cautionary tale. I checked in without adding emotion to my voice, because emotion is what turns an HR meeting into a theater production, and I had no interest in playing the villain in my wife's little community play. I sat in the waiting area where the chairs were too clean and the magazines were too old, and I watched the elevator doors like they might open and reveal the cast. My phone stayed face down, not because I was hiding anything, but because I wanted my hands empty and visible when the accusations started. Empty hands make it harder for people to claim you were aggressive. The conference room was on the main floor, exactly as the email said, which meant someone wanted the meeting accessible, visible, and easy to describe later to whoever asked why I was called in. When the HR representative appeared, she wore a polite expression that looked practiced, and I recognized it immediately as the same face people wear when they are about to offer you a procedural rope and wait to see if you tie it around your own neck. She motioned for me to follow, and I did, because compliance is not surrender when you control what you put on record. My supervisor was already inside, sitting stiffly with his hands folded, eyes avoiding mine like eye contact might contaminate him with the rumor. A second HR person sat beside him with a laptop open, fingers resting on the keys like she was ready to type my obituary. There was also a fourth chair, angled slightly toward the head of the table, and it was empty, which meant it was reserved for whoever the email had called a community representative. The phrase still made my skin itch, because workplaces do not use community representatives unless they want the outside world to weigh in on your inside life. I placed my folder on the table, did not open it, and sat down with my back straight and my feet planted. I made a point of not crossing my arms because crossed arms get described as defensive, and I had learned that the story matters more than the truth to people who need the truth to be convenient. The HR lead began with the standard language about professionalism, safety, and confidentiality. Then she shifted into the vague fog again, describing concerns raised by multiple people, suggesting patterns, implying instability without naming a single action. I listened without interrupting, because interruptions get described as aggression, and I wanted the first clear line on the record to be mine. When she finished her introductory fog, I asked for the specific allegation in plain terms, the date range, and the policy section being referenced, and I asked it in the same tone a person uses to confirm a meeting time. My supervisor blinked, and the second HR person's fingers began to move, and I felt a small satisfaction, because the moment a laptop begins recording, your enemy's improvisation becomes risk. The HR lead said the report suggested I had created a hostile environment through intimidation, and she said it like she was reading it off a script written by someone who has never met me. She mentioned a spouse expressing fear, a neighbor expressing concern, and a coworker allegedly noticing mood swings, which was impressive in its variety and completely useless without details. I nodded once, then asked whether any of the claims included dates, times, specific behaviors, or written statements signed by the person making them. She hesitated, then said confidentiality limited what could be shared, which was a polite way of admitting she had been handed smoke. I asked that the minutes reflect that I had requested specifics and that none were provided in the meeting, and I watched the second HR person type that sentence, which felt like watching a lock click into place. Then I asked whether the community representative would be joining and what role they would play, because I wanted it defined before they walked in, and began narrating my life like a documentary villain. The HR lead said the representative was present to provide context related to concerns raised outside the workplace. I nodded again, because that was the whole point, and my wife was not subtle. The door opened, and the community representative walked in like a man arriving at a stage he had rented for the evening. It was Carter Hale, the HOA president, wearing a blazer that smelled like cheap cologne and authority. He gave a tight smile at the room, then a slightly wider smile at me, the kind people use when they want you to know they can hurt you without lifting a finger. He sat in the angled chair and placed a thin folder on the table as if he had a case file, and for a second the urge to laugh rose in my throat, because the HOA president was now sitting in my workplace conference room like a prosecutor. Carter began speaking before HR even invited him, describing neighbor concerns, domestic instability, and a safety atmosphere. And he did it with the same tone he used at the clubhouse, the tone of a man who believes rumor becomes fact once it enters a room with fluorescent lighting. He did not mention dates, he did not mention specific incidents, and he did not offer anything beyond the general shape of fear. He referred to my wife as someone who had been forced to leave, and he implied I was volatile, and he implied the neighborhood was watching. I listened, then turned back to HR and asked a simple question: whether the workplace intended to treat HOA gossip as workplace evidence. The HR lead's mouth tightened slightly, because she did not like being forced to admit what was happening. She said they were not treating gossip as evidence, but they were taking external concerns seriously as part of a holistic approach to safety. Holistic is a beautiful word people use when they have nothing solid and still want to act. I asked again, calmly, whether Carter's statements included any objective proof, and I asked whether the HOA had a written complaint with a named witness attached. Carter shifted in his chair and said confidentiality protected residents, which meant he had nothing he could stand behind if challenged. I asked the second HR person to note that Carter could not provide dates, times, or named complaints, and I watched her type it. Carter's smile thinned, and he tried to pivot by describing my demeanor as combative, as if requesting specifics was a threat. I kept my gaze on HR, not on him, because this was not his room and I was not going to grant him control by engaging directly. I stated that I would answer any specific allegation with specific documentation and that I would not speculate or improvise. I said it without anger, without sarcasm, and it felt almost surgical. The HR lead asked whether I wanted to provide a statement, and that was the invitation my wife expected would turn into a messy confession. Instead, I opened my folder and slid a single page across the table, face down at first. Then I turned it over so everyone could read the header. It was a one-page timeline with dates, times, and sources, written in simple language without emotional adjectives. I asked the HR lead to read each section aloud and to tell me which line they believed constituted intimidation or hostility. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain myself. I simply asked the room to do the one thing liars cannot tolerate: point to a fact and name it. The HR lead began reading, and as she read, I watched Carter's posture change, because he was not used to rooms where words get pinned down. The timeline listed the divorce ambush in my home with my wife and her friends present, the HOA hearing, the anonymous complaint problem, and the HR email requesting vague concerns. It listed my written response, requesting specifics. It listed the shared account merchant alert for a hotel deposit and noted it as a documented charge on an account in my name. It listed the existence of a private group chat coaching witnesses to use scripted phrases and to contact my workplace with vague safety concerns. When the HR lead reached the group chat line, she paused and asked what I meant by a coaching chat. I slid a clear sleeve toward the second HR person, containing the screenshot printout, signed on the back with the time I received it, and accompanied by a plain description of how it came to me. I did not name the sender in the room because I did not need to. I only needed HR to understand that the complaint process had been targeted and coordinated. The second HR person took the sleeve, read the screenshot, and her eyes changed in a way that reminded me institutions do, in fact, recognize manipulation when it is spelled out in black and white. Carter leaned forward and said the screenshot could be fabricated, which was predictable, because liars always demand you prove reality itself. I looked at the HR lead and said I was not asking the workplace to decide my marriage. I was asking it to recognize a coordinated attempt to weaponize its process. I asked whether HR wanted to verify the authenticity of the screenshot through normal procedures, and I offered to provide the original file if requested, along with the message thread showing when it was sent to me, because a chain of custody is harder to fake than a feeling. My supervisor finally spoke, sounding uncomfortable, and asked why any of this was happening. His question was not cruel, just tired, like a man trying to understand why his quiet workplace had been dragged into someone else's divorce war. I answered in a single sentence, because long answers become stories, and stories become targets. I said my wife had coordinated a divorce ambush with her friends, and when I refused to react the way she wanted, she moved the fight into institutions that could punish me without proof. I did not add details about affairs in that moment, because the room was already crowded with enough betrayal to process. The HR lead looked at Carter and asked whether he could provide anything beyond anonymous concern statements. Carter's face tightened, and he repeated the same confidentiality line again, which made it obvious he had no documentation and had never intended to produce any. The HR lead then asked me whether I had any direct contact with neighbors that could be interpreted as threatening. I said no, and I said it simply. Then I slid a second clear sleeve forward, containing the still frame from my own doorway camera, showing my wife leaving calmly with her bags, timestamp visible, no confrontation. I stated that the household event she described as forced out was documented as voluntary departure without conflict, and I asked that it be entered into the record. Carter's jaw worked as if he wanted to argue, but he could not argue with a timestamp without inventing new fog. The HR lead asked him whether he was aware of the private group chat coordinating claims. Carter said he was not, and he tried to make himself sound like an innocent civic leader caught in the middle. That was almost believable until he did something small and revealing. He referred to my wife's claim as a safety incident, using the exact same phrasing she had used in the HOA email. It was the same language, the same rhythm, and it sounded rehearsed. The second HR person glanced at the screenshot again, then back at Carter, because she noticed it too. Then the door opened again, and for 1 second, I expected my wife to walk in because she had always loved an audience. Instead, a woman stepped in with a tight face and a posture so rigid it looked like she was holding herself together by force. She asked for the HR lead by name, and the HR lead looked surprised and said they were in a confidential meeting. The woman said she understood, but she had been named in a complaint request, and she was there to correct the record before it got dirtier. It was Marla, one of my wife's friends, and the room shifted instantly, because nothing scares a coordinated liar like a member of the coordination deciding to tell the truth. Marla's eyes went to Carter first, then to me, then back to HR, and I could see the conflict in her face, the tug between embarrassment and fury. She said she had been part of a group chat that had become something ugly, and she said she had documentation showing that my wife had coached language and encouraged people to contact my workplace. She said she had not understood the full scope until her own marriage started collapsing, and now she wanted the workplace to know the complaints were being manufactured to create leverage. Carter tried to speak, but the HR lead held up a hand, and asked Marla whether she had evidence. Marla placed her phone on the table and slid it forward. Then she placed printed screenshots beside it, each page annotated with dates and times visible in the message thread. She did not make a speech. She did not beg. She simply put the material down like a person tired of being used. The HR lead asked the second HR person to photograph the pages for the file, and I watched Carter's face go pale in a way that made me feel briefly almost sorry for him. Almost. The late twist hit like a silent door closing. Carter was not a neutral civic leader who had stumbled into a marital mess. He was the delivery system my wife had selected because he enjoyed his own authority enough to be weaponized. And Marla, the woman my wife assumed would stay loyal, had become the witness my wife underestimated, the one who brought the scripting into daylight where it could no longer pretend to be concern. The HR lead turned to Carter and asked whether he had any relationship with my wife beyond the HOA context. Carter said he did not. Marla looked at him and said she had seen him at my wife's house on the day of the divorce ambush, arriving early and staying late, and she said it with the flat certainty of someone who no longer cared about politeness. Carter's mouth opened, then closed, and the second HR person typed faster, because now the meeting had moved from vague concern to documented coordination. I sat still, because the most satisfying victories are the ones you do not contaminate with celebration. I watched HR's posture change from listening to evaluating, and that change mattered more than any apology ever could. The HR lead stated that based on the information provided, they could not proceed with any adverse action against me without credible, specific evidence of workplace misconduct. She said they would open a case regarding potential abuse of the reporting process and potential harassment through external coordination, and she asked Marla whether she was willing to provide a statement verifying the origin of the screenshots. Marla said yes, and she said it like she had already decided to burn the bridge and walk away. Carter stood up as if he wanted to leave before the record caught him fully. The HR lead asked him to remain seated because leaving mid-meeting would be noted. Carter hesitated, then sat back down, and I saw in his eyes the realization that his favorite kind of room, the one where he could imply and posture, had become the worst kind of room for him, the one where minutes get typed and proof gets stapled. The HR lead asked me one final question, whether I had contacted any neighbors or co-workers in a way that could be interpreted as threatening. I answered no, and I offered my phone call log screenshots if needed, but I did not push them forward, because I was not going to drown the room in data. The goal was not to prove I was a saint. The goal was to show the complaint was engineered. The HR lead nodded and said they would document that I had denied any threatening contact and that no specific incident had been provided to contradict it. Then the HR lead did the one thing my wife had never planned for, because she was addicted to soft power, not hard procedure. She asked the second HR person to generate a case ID for the misuse of process and to log the evidence as received. The second HR person read the case number aloud, typed a line stating evidence received, and saved the entry. The HR lead looked at me and said the original complaint would be placed on hold pending review and that I would receive written confirmation by end of day. Written confirmation is not justice in the romantic sense. It is better. It is a document that survives gossip. Carter tried one last time to regain narrative control, saying he had acted out of concern and that he had a duty to protect residents. The HR lead responded in a calm, lethal tone, stating that concern does not excuse coordinating unverified claims to influence workplace decisions, and that any further attempts to contact the workplace in bad faith could be treated as harassment and referred to legal counsel. Carter's face stiffened, and he nodded, not because he agreed, but because he had been cornered by policy. The meeting ended with HR standing, not as a gesture of respect, but as a signal that the room was no longer a stage. I gathered my folder slowly because haste looks like anxiety, and anxiety looks like guilt to the kind of people who prefer easy conclusions. Marla collected her phone and her printouts, and her hands trembled slightly as she did, because truth-telling has a cost even when it is necessary. Carter left without looking at me, because he could not look at the person whose quiet record had just stripped him of his performance. As I walked out into the lobby, I finally saw my wife near the elevators, standing with her two friends, watching the conference room door like they were waiting for a verdict announcement. Her face held that same careful sadness, the one she used to sell fear as truth. But when she saw Marla step out behind me, carrying her own evidence, her expression broke for half a second, and in that half second I saw the only thing that mattered: surprise. My wife took a step forward as if she wanted to speak, as if she wanted to pull me into a hallway scene where she could regain control with volume and tears. I did not stop. I did not turn toward her. I simply walked past because the record had already been typed, the case ID had already been read aloud, and the narrative she had built out of fog had just collided with paper. Behind me, I heard the elevator ding, then the sharp shift of voices rising. Not mine, not Marla's, but the brittle sound of alliances snapping in public. I kept walking anyway, because my revenge was never going to be a speech. It was going to be silence backed by documents, and today, the documents finally spoke first.